Thank you, everybody, for joining us today at TAC's Tic Talk. I'm your co-host, Jacqueline Bush Toussard, along with my co-host, Dr. Joseph Paul Bush, our editor of the American Chiropractor. We are very honored today to be with our guest, Dr. Freddie Ulan. He has graced the cover of the magazine at least more than once. I think at least twice I can recall. He's definitely got decades worth of experience and practice as both a chiropractor and a nutrition expert in the Ulan nutrition response testing method. So without further ado, I know we've only got a quick 30 minutes with you and we could talk for hours on end. So Dr. Freddie Ulan.
Glad to see you both at the same time and actually able to hear you.
Yeah, vice versa. Same.
How would you like to get into this?
Well, okay, Dr. Freddie. Now, one of the things that brought about this conversation is because over the years, we've had a lot of input from you, and obviously, since 2020, the world went through some major whatever we went through, and so. Yeah. What was true, untrue, what happened, what doesn't happen, it doesn't really matter to us at this point. What it is you are a clinician as well as an expert to be able to tell us what you guys have found since then, what to you you're seeing with the patients and what kind of accomplishments, as well as observations and then techniques and information you think that the doctors should be able to take advantage of from your perspective.
That's quite a mouthful. Let me see. I guess the best place to start really is in the clinic, because what we noticed, and it started about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, it started to become obvious that the patients were not responding like they normally did to the protocols we've evolved, which are all based on a very personalized body analysis. But we got all this stuff worked out. It's been a perfect drill that literally has not had to change other than with some updated products. And, there's been a few, but the basic drill has just been a perfect one. It's been near perfect. And suddenly we were finding people who were not responding, things that you'd normally expect to see changes rather rapidly, were taking too long. They would get better, then they get worse. Then they get better again, then they get worse. Then they would start developing new things that they never had before. When you're dealing with patients, especially in the type of practice that we run and that we've been teaching our colleagues to run, which is a long-term wellness practice. So we have many patients that have been with us for years. And you know what's going on with them, and it was a mystery, and that opened the door to every time I find something I can't figure out, I'm always looking at, okay, there's a hidden cause going here that I've got to find. I've got to find a hidden cause. Now, obviously, the elephant in the room had something to do with COVID, and just based on my own bias and years of experience in this industry, the so-called vaccination. I hate to call it a vaccination because it's not a vaccination in the normal sense of the word, but this mRNA concoction seemed to be date coincident. In other words, when people were first getting sick, those who did get sick, they responded quite well to the normal protocols to beef up their body's ability to reduce the replication of viruses, which can all be done nutritionally, to boost the body's ability to handle the effect of viruses, to clean out the debris, and you'd have people recover. Yes, it was more intense than a lot of things we've been handling over the years, but it was just kind of the exaggerated routine, if I could coin a phrase. But it started getting worse after they cycled through the initial mRNA injections, and now they were pushing the boosters. And what we found was people who'd been injected and boosted especially were having much more intense episodes of of acute illnesses, and that chronic conditions would exacerbate. Like suddenly somebody who had a mild history of cardiac problems, cardiovascular problems, was suddenly having real trouble with it. We saw cancer cases which were being beautifully controlled with nutrition and diet, and patients were actually doing very well, suddenly go into hyper mode and suddenly needing emergency medical interventions. And so looking at the research and what was coming up on this, I learned a lot about what this mRNA stuff is and what these injections are doing. And basically, as simply as I can put it, these injections reprogram your DNA to produce spike proteins. Now, it doesn't work on everybody. And we don't know whether that's because they have an inconsistent supply that's different from batch to batch. But it doesn't work on everybody. But on the people it works on, it hits their weakest areas. So that if you have, for example, a type 2 diabetic who's got a pancreas that's been under stress and is overworked, and the whole insulin insufficiency so-called situation, suddenly that was worse. If they had any kind of borderline cardiovascular situation, it was worse. Respiratory situations were worse. Liver problems became worse. And when you're talking about a liver getting worse, you're talking about their ability to digest proteins and fats, their ability to detox the normal metabolites. So that people were getting sick, people were getting depressed, people were showing so-called Prozac deficiencies, which we know have nothing to do with Prozac. So all of these things were getting worse. And then it was a matter of, okay, let's dig in and see what the actual factors are involved that are causing this. And I connected up with some of the more advanced folks in the medical freedom movement to see what research that they had found. And I started out with a list of 8 things that were commonly found, which was the COVID virus itself. And it was amazing how many of these people were not suffering from the COVID virus itself, even though they were having COVID type symptoms. We developed a way of testing for whether or not they were suffering from the vaccine itself, the jab itself, the mRNA product, regardless of manufacturer. Whether they were suffering from, this was really digging in, we found a whole bunch of people who had the symptoms of post-vaccination who had never been vaccinated.
Wow.
And so we developed a test to see whether or not what they were suffering from was gotten through a process called shedding. Now, shedding has been known about in the alternative vaccine movement for decades. The fact that people who were vaccinated with a particular attenuated virus could pass on that virus to somebody else who hadn't been vaccinated. Well, the big clue for me was that one of the early reports that came up, and this was like a big aha moment, was they had statistics on the number of pregnant nurses who were administering the vaccine, and they had an 80% spontaneous miscarriage.
No, that's ridiculous.
Yeah. That was absolutely outrageous. And this was in one hospital where they happened to have a bunch of pregnant nurses who were delivering the vaccines. And there was an 80% of them went into a spontaneous miscarriage. And they were not even vaccinated yet. This was not even at the time where medical personnel were required to be vaccinated. Once they were vaccinated, then all kinds of stuff started showing up, especially serious neurologic problems. And then we were observing this other thing that seemed to be, was this connected or not? All these young athletes dropping dead on a playing field. Remember that? I mean, that was like, they called it sudden adult death syndrome.
Right. They
You know, which
got a
is
new name
typical.
for it, right?
You know, yeah. Oh, I know what he died of: sudden adult death syndrome.
It works
No,
for the babies, so just don't even think about it. It's got a name.
just crazy. So what we found basically was that the common denominator of all these people, whether they were suffering from the vaccines, from the shedding of vaccines, from others, various other factors that were part of this whole thing, was foreign proteins.
Uh-huh.
Foreign proteins. Now that we know that the coronavirus is called a coronavirus because it has these corona-like spikes that apparently are sticking out of the surface of the virus. But these spikes, when they get into circulation, they go deep into the microcirculation and they get stuck in the weak organs. So they have huge affinity for the heart and the nervous system and female reproductive system. These are the big areas. But if you happen to have a a pre-existing condition where you have a weakness somewhere else, whether it's your liver, your spleen, your lungs, your thyroid, it'll hit that first, and then it'll go into these other organs. So you have all this exacerbation. So the bottom line really was, once we got onto the fact of the viruses, then it was of the proteins, then it was working out how to spot what it was so that we could help the person stop re-exposing themselves, uh, and two, helping the body break down these proteins. And basically, they needed very strong proteolytic enzymes. And then on the so-called long COVID cases, which are actually long vax cases in almost every case, uh, the spike proteins would set up irritation in the microcapillaries, and the body would respond to that irritation by laying in a layer of fibrin. And then the fibrin would build up, and you'd end up with all this clotting occurring because of a breakdown in circulation. So, in order to help these people, we had to actually find the strongest, safest fibrinolytic enzymes. So, for example, a typical protocol would be giving the person initially we had separate products for all of these things, giving them a fibrinolytic uh, enzyme formula, which would break down the fibrous covering. And then as you're doing that, you add the proteolytic enzyme, which now breaks down the spike protein, which is stuck in the capillary bed and creating the inflammation. And then some sort of drainage to help all this stuff, all these particles move out through the liver, through the bile. And what we were running into is, especially in elderly people, and I'm in that category, is that the load of debris was so heavy it would shut down phase 2 detox in the liver. So these people would suddenly be developing autotoxification symptoms, which very often included, by the way, extreme fatigue, weird pains, and depression, mental depression. So the number of these people who go to the doctor and say, "Oh God, I'm so depressed," they end up being put on psych drugs, antidepressants, stimulants, and actually what they need was just something that would open up those detox channels safely and let the body do its job. So it's been it's been quite a ride for these 2 years. Really, uh, from my earlier work that prior to the COVID scene, we had identified 5 of the most common barriers to healing, and these were working beautifully. And when the COVID thing hit and the vaccinations hit, I was hoping that this was just a temporary phase, but it's not. Now they've done multiple studies. Dr. Malone has I'm sure you're familiar with his name. He's the guy who actually developed the mRNA technology in the first place, not for this purpose, and has been the major spokesman exposing what it is and what it does. Um, these guys have helped us tremendously by giving us knowledge about what this stuff consists of. So uh, it they've been doing studies now to see how long does the mRNA mutation that is created in the recipient's body that turns it into a spike protein manufacturing machine, how long does it work? So they did their initial study for 90 days. And I don't know how these guys think, but to me, it's absolutely crazy. But they did the initial study for 90 days, and they found that the people that were in the study were still producing spike proteins at the end of 90 days, but they had to end the study because that was the parameter. So then they did a new study for 180 days and found many people were still producing the spike proteins after 180 days, and they haven't extended it yet. But my experience is that we're picking up from people who've been vaccinated 2 years ago. We're still picking up spike proteins, but in some of them, it's because of the proximity to people who've been vaccinated and who are keeping their boosters updated.
Freddie, you've
Now,
covered
yes,
a lot of ground. You've covered a lot of ground, Kevin, Freddie. So I want to, because we need to talk, right? you hit the ground running, man. It was 30 minutes to get us up and going, but you're ready to go.
I was worried
So
about a minute interview because this could go on for 2 days, really.
please, I mean, I would love it for it to go on for at least a couple hours, but I just want to be sure. Now, you mentioned you have this testing protocol that you've been developing, and of course, you've got all these years and decades of experience. And just where were you practicing at the time? Was it in Florida? Because a lot of people couldn't even touch people at some point. And then also, talk a little bit about your testing protocol, how that is transferable to what you do, and how do people learn it?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm located in Florida these days, so we were in the free state of Florida.
Yeah,
Um, and
that
we had
helped.
more freedom and less policing than people in California or New York or Detroit or Chicago or any of these major metropolitan areas. We're in the middle of the state, in the Clearwater, Tampa, St. Pete area, which is even more free than, for example, Southern Florida in Miami, which in many ways comes a little too close to resembling some of the other big cities in other parts of the country. So most of our clinicians were still seeing patients that
Right.
in this area, but we also had people out in the boondocks, who I'm in continuous communication with, who say, Freddie, we're running into this. What is, and I started collecting data from over 100 different data points. These are past graduates of the Advanced Clinical Training and Nutrition Response Testing Program. These are clinical masters. These are people who are incredibly effective in helping to get sick people well. And that's where the data all came from. Now, all of this evolved going back. Oh my God. I don't know if we have enough time to get into it, but I was a straight chiropractor. I was raised on you give a chiropractic adjustment, you free up the flow of innate intelligence through the body, and it does the job. Uh, I was even I was even raised during a time when we were told it didn't matter what you eat because innate intelligence, uninterrupted, will convert whatever you eat into whatever you need. That
Well,
was
so what was the change? What caused you to deviate from that path?
back in the 80s. Um, in the early 80s, I was actually at the prime of my health. I was 40 years old. 1984, I was 40 years old. I'm now 80 and a half. It's so
It still
unbelievable.
matters.
80 and a
How
half. Is
many,
that 80 puntos, like 0.5, or is this 85 in full disclosure?
yeah,
Because they're both great accomplishments.
well, especially since the fact is that by the middle of 1980s, I started getting sick all of a sudden, and no, my usual chiropractic adjustments weren't helping. They would give me, I mean, I would get some relief while I was in the office. By the time I got to my car, I needed another adjustment. Uh, I was in a lot of pain. My immune system started crashing. It took 5 years till I actually hit bottom, and I was in bed. I had a pneumonia that would not quit, double pneumonia. I couldn't sleep because I couldn't lie down because of all the fluid in my lungs.
Wow.
My cardiovascular system was not working. Any motion caused like an angina type of pain everywhere,
Wow.
and uh, I finally, I'm getting 3, 4 adjustments a day,
Mm-hmm.
From colleagues who would be visiting me, and they would take turn. Oh, it's 10 o'clock. It's my turn to go see Dr. Ulan, and getting nowhere. Finally, going to a couple of medical friends of mine who said, "Yeah, you've got a serious condition here. We have no idea what to do with it."
Right.
And I was literally told to, prepare for my next adventure.
Man.
And my spouse at the time said, "Look, you're the doctor. Figure it out."
Figured out.
And it was like, "Oh my God! This is before the internet. You can
Yeah.
just ask Doctor Google. What do I do? I'm real tired and I got fluid in my lungs.
Well, thank goodness for that, because it might deviate you anyway.
Yeah,
I'm not
exactly.
saying Google's always got the right answers. It's got an answer. It's not always the right one.
Well, I ended up going down to Mexico to one of the alternative clinics. I got detoxed basically and IVs and stuff I've never ever done before. And they
Mm-hmm.
built my body up with IVs and they cleaned me out, and then they put me on a juice diet from the organic vegetables in their organic garden.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, I didn't have pneumonia anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember talking to the doctor. His name was Dr. Rodrigo Rodriguez. That was his name. I don't know if he's still there at American Biologics. And I said, "So what's your prognosis?" And he said, "Where are you going after this?" I said, "Well, at that time I was living in Southern California." I said, "I'm going home." He goes, "You'll probably be dead in a year if you go back there." And why? Because there's so much toxicity around that your body is not capable of handling it. I ended up moving to Florida. So,
Wow.
but I was no longer dying, but I had a body that couldn't function more than a couple hours a day. So that led me to the how do you rebuild a body that you've knocked the heck out of by hard living, fast living, lots of traveling, working hard, enjoying yourself, uh, and that took me down the path to the great nutritional clinical nutritionists of the 20th century, which was Royal Lee and Weston Price and these fellows, a handful of guys that were brilliant, whose works were not available. They were suppressed. Royal Lee had all of his works. He had to agree to burning all of his notes in order to not go to jail in the 60s. And they literally had a bonfire.
It was even happening back then. Isn't that amazing? It's only gotten like now it's on steroids. I mean, now they'll just delete you if you want your stuff to be on the internet. I mean, that's not necessarily a safe
Why we
place.
still mail to 50,000 chiropractors every month in
You
print.
can't trust these guys.
In print.
Utterly amazing. And Royal Lee actually hit the nail on the head somewhere about 1947. He said, "Look, the health of this country is going downhill rapidly," and he traced it back to the degradation of the food supply, the soil, the pesticides, the commercialization of food, which took it out of local grown, accessible in season, etc., to this thing which is, so much worse now than it was in
Oh, please.
1947.
The
But
hormones they're on, these animals are on that we're consuming, and all the medications.
so that was big. That was enlightening for me because, as I told you, I was raised as a chiropractic zealot. My father was a chiropractic zealot. He never became a chiropractor, but he used to build people's practices because everybody he saw, he'd say, "How are you doing?" And they'd say, "Fine." He'd say, "No, really." And when he'd finally pull it out of them, he would then drag them to a chiropractor. And that's what he did just on a daily basis. It was he had a statistic of how many new people can I bring to one of my network of chiropractors in different parts of New York City. And so we got sick, we got an adjustment, we recovered. That stopped happening by the time I got into practice in 1965. That's when I first started practicing. It was not happening in the same way, and chiropractic was almost gone. You might remember. I don't know if either of you were young enough,
Contain and
old enough.
eliminate.
Yeah, and what saved chiropractic was something totally weird, which was practice management. How to sell people multiple adjustments, 36 adjustments, and that was totally unheard of in the 1940s and 50s when I grew up. When
Uh-huh.
you had asthma, you went to the you went to the chiropractor. He gave you 2 adjustments. You were fine. Then he said, "Good. It's probably a good idea to come once a month from now on." That was practice management in the 40s and 50s. And
Right.
so you had chiropractic having to compensate for the fact that people couldn't hold their adjustments anymore, and
Mm-hmm.
it's only gotten worse since
Mm-hmm.
then. That was back in the 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to become an expert in communicating to people that they needed a lot of adjustments, but they
Mm-hmm.
did, because otherwise they became permanent pharmaceutical clients, which
Right.
then created the whole cascading degradation of their health, and wrecked their finances, wrecked their family life, left their quality of life.
Right. Right. Right.
So the thing that was the big thing for me was, here I was in that same situation in the 80s, not able to hold an adjustment, hitting rock bottom in 1992. I was this close to my deathbed, and
Wow.
it was finally getting an intervention, which was a medical intervention, but very different than a U.S. conventional medical intervention.
Right.
And suddenly, and then going and having the realization, my body has fallen apart. How do you repair it? And I realized that it had to be done on a cell by cell basis. How could you do that?
Mm-hmm.
That's what led me into nutrition. And I found some guys with some answers. And these were the people we just mentioned, Royal Lee and Weston Price, etc. Um, so from that, we found that they were trying to work on protocols, and I found that the protocols didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had to connect up with some people who were investigating the autonomic nervous system and how it worked, and figure out what supported what function in the autonomic nervous system, and how could you measure that. And we took a line from Dr. D.T. Palmer, of all people, uh,
Mm-hmm.
who had that famous quote in the book called The Chiropractor. And this became the stable datum for me. He said, when educated and innate intelligences are able to converse with each other, a possibility which a not very distant future may disclose, we shall be able to get a correct diagnosis. And that opened a door for me. I went, oh my God, if there is a way of accessing the autonomic nervous system, which is the body's expression of its innate intelligence, and put all bias aside, my education, my educated intelligence aside, and just go, okay, what is the body telling me?
Mm-hmm.
Then we can apply my intelligence to that, not to
Right.
some fixed idea that I have. And that was the birthplace of what has become known as nutrition response testing. It's a
Mm-hmm.
system of using the body's own reflexes to identify the stress areas of the body. But
Mm-hmm.
then we had to take it a step further, because when we first started doing this, you could check somebody who might have 8 or 9 different areas of stress. And this is a real problem when someone's got 3, 4, 5 organs that are not functioning. We found that if you tried treating all those organs, it was an overwhelm for the body. So we had to figure out, and we did this again through our neurologic testing. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
what's the priority? What's the thing which, if you started with this,
Mm-hmm.
it would start a cascade of healing going? And
Right.
maybe you had to handle layer 1, layer 2. By the time you got to layer 3, everything else was innate intelligence was able to handle the body. And yes, you had to give the person structural corrections and things like that, because the body structure goes totally out of whack from
Mm-hmm.
the nutritional deficiencies and toxicities.
Mm-hmm.
So
Freddie, you
yeah,
mentioned that you work with a lot of masters. How long? I have 2 questions. How long does it take for a guy who's listening, who wants to use these types of techniques to assess? How long does it take for them to become a master in those types of tests? And then number two, is it different or similar to, like, say, the AK testing, maybe, that was prominent in the 80s, or did you get some inspiration from that group of people?